Alec had never been one to enjoy company. He lived alone in the remote wastelands of Cerulean, a planet on the edge of human colonization. The colony was small, quiet, and far from the busy centers of human life. Alec had once been part of the bustling city life, but those days felt like a distant memory. He was content in his isolation, surrounded only by the machines he fixed and the vast stretches of empty land that seemed to echo his solitude. On this day, however, the silence was broken by a crash. It was a sound like nothing Alec had heard before. A deep, rumbling roar followed by a violent explosion that shook the ground beneath his feet. He dropped his wrench and sprinted toward the source of the noise, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what it could be. A crash, yes, but what kind of crash? The dust was thick when he reached the site, a large crater smoldering in the center of a rocky plain. But it wasn't a meteor, as he first assumed. No, this was something different. Something far stranger. The wreckage was an alien ship, its sleek metal surface shimmering with a strange energy. It lay broken and twisted in the crater, its once perfect form now shattered by the force of its crash. Smoke poured from the ship's hull, and small flames flickered in the dark, dry atmosphere. Alec's eyes narrowed as he approached cautiously, drawn by an unfamiliar urge. His mind raced with questions: who had crashed here, and why? Then he heard it, a faint, muffled sound coming from within the wreckage. It was a soft, almost melodic hum. Alec hesitated for a moment before stepping closer to the ship. He wasn't a soldier, nor a member of the colony's defense team, but his years as a mechanic had taught him to approach the unknown with caution and curiosity. He reached the edge of the ship's broken hull and peered inside. His breath caught in his throat. There, sprawled among the wreckage, was a figure, a woman. She was unlike any human Alec had ever seen. Her skin was a deep, shimmering shade of violet, and her hair flowed like liquid silver, shimmering in the light. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught his attention. It was the way she lay motionless, as if she had been knocked unconscious by the crash. Her body was covered in what looked like a thin metallic armor, but it was cracked and damaged, just like the ship. Alec's instincts kicked in. He knew he had to help her. The authorities would arrive soon, and the last thing he needed was to be caught in the middle of some intergalactic disaster. But he couldn't just leave her here, not like this. Without thinking twice, Alec moved closer and began pulling at the wreckage. He had no idea who this woman was or where she had come from, but he couldn't let her die in the remains of this wreck. He had to act. With some effort, Alec freed her from the twisted metal. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin was cold to the touch. He needed to get her to shelter, somewhere safe. He glanced around and noticed his workshop in the distance. It was the only building nearby, far from the colony's main settlement, a place where no one would question his actions. Alec carefully lifted the woman, bracing her body against his as he started the long walk back to his workshop. It wasn't easy. Her body felt strangely light, almost fragile, but he managed. The wind kicked up dust around them, and the silence of the wasteland seemed almost eerie. Yet Alec was determined, his mind focused on the task at hand. When he finally reached his workshop, Alec hurried inside, setting the woman down on the workbench he used for repairs. The space was cluttered with half-finished machines, tools, and parts of broken-down vehicles. It was a place Alec had spent countless hours working on things, but never something as complex as the alien ship he had just found. He took a step back, observing the woman carefully. There was no sign of injury on her face, but her chest rose and fell with a slow rhythm, as if she were still unconscious, fighting to stay alive. Alec wasn't sure what to do next, but he couldn't leave her like this. His heart raced, but not out of fear. He didn't know why, but there was something about her that drew him in, something familiar in her alien features. As he reached for a nearby med kit, he noticed something strange, a faint glow coming from the woman's chest. Her armor was damaged, but there was something underneath it, something pulsing with light. Alec froze, unsure of what he was seeing. His fingers hovered over the glowing section, but he hesitated. It wasn't human technology. He had no idea what it was, but his curiosity and mechanical instincts pushed him forward. Before he could touch the glowing light, the woman's eyes snapped open. Her gaze was sharp and piercing, the color of her eyes a bright, almost unnatural shade of blue. She looked up at Alec for a moment, confusion written across her face, before her eyes fluttered, and she whispered, barely audible, "You are human." Alec's mouth went dry. He had no idea what to say. "Yes," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I am. What happened to you?" The woman's expression changed, something between pain and recognition flashing in her eyes. "My people, they are gone. I am alone." Alec felt a pang in his chest, a deep, strange sadness for this alien he had never met. He didn't know how to respond, but in that moment, he realized something. The woman needed help, and somehow, she had found him. As the silence hung in the air between them, Alec knew this was only the beginning of something bigger, something he couldn't yet understand. Alec spent the next few hours staring at the woman as she rested on the workbench. Her strange violet skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the workshop. She didn't move much, her breathing slow but steady. Alec had always been a man of action, someone who fixed things, who worked with his hands, but this was different. The woman in front of him wasn't something he could just fix like a broken machine. She was alive, fragile, mysterious, and clearly in pain. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just an ordinary crash. The way she had looked at him, as if she saw something inside him, something broken, something hidden. It troubled him. But for now, Alec needed to focus on the task at hand, making sure she survived. Carefully, he adjusted the lighting above her and began to examine her more closely. Her armor was sophisticated, almost like it was alive, reacting to her movements. It was clearly not of human design, but Alec couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of it. The metal seemed to shimmer, almost like it was responding to some unseen force. He reached for his tools, his mind racing with questions. Where had she come from? What was she fleeing? Why had she ended up on this forgotten planet, so far from the rest of the galaxy? The answers would have to wait. Right now, Alec had a more immediate problem: how to repair her ship. He turned his attention to the wreckage outside, where the alien vessel still lay, half buried in the dirt. Alec wasn't an expert in alien technology, far from it, but he had an instinct for machines. He'd fixed everything from old vehicles to broken-down computers. This would be something else entirely. But the ship needed repair, and it was clear that the woman would not be able to help him. Not yet. Alec grabbed his jacket and left the workshop, walking back to the crash site. The alien ship still emitted a soft hum, almost like it was alive, breathing through the twisted metal. As he neared the wreckage, Alec felt a strange sensation, an unease, a shiver running down his spine. The ship had a strange energy to it, something beyond the usual mechanical systems he was used to. But Alec didn't have time to waste on hesitation. He had no choice but to dive in. He reached for a piece of metal, trying to pull it free, but the ship seemed to resist him. It was as if the wreckage itself was trying to hold onto its secrets, unwilling to let go. He paused for a moment, his hand on the ship's surface. Something deep inside the hull glowed faintly. It was subtle, but Alec could see it clearly. His curiosity flared, and without thinking, he slid his fingers along the surface. The glow grew brighter. Alec took a step back, surprised. It was as if the ship recognized his touch. The strange hum intensified, and the ship began to shift. Metal groaned as it moved, parts of the wreckage loosening as though responding to his actions. Alec's heart raced. He knew that this wasn't just any ship. He had seen enough machinery in his life to recognize that what he was dealing with wasn't of human origin. This was something extraordinary, and somehow he was connected to it. A sudden noise behind him broke his concentration. He turned around quickly, only to see the woman, Etrana, standing at the edge of the workshop, her hand pressed against the doorframe. She looked pale, but her eyes were clearer now, focused. She was awake. You're fixing it," she said, her voice still weak, but there was a hint of awe in it. "You can hear it, can't you?" Alec was taken aback. He hadn't expected her to be up so soon. He thought she was still unconscious. I don't know if I can fix it," he admitted, "but I'm trying." Etrana slowly made her way toward him, her steps unsteady, but determined. "You are the first human I've encountered who's touched my ship, and lived." Alec frowned, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean?" "I'm just a mechanic." "I'm not." She interrupted him with a slight shake of her head. "You don't understand. My ship, it is not like your machines. It is alive in its own way. It responds to those who can connect with it. I was never able to do that. But you?" She paused, her eyes locking onto Alec with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You've already repaired it. The ship feels you. It trusts you." Alec didn't know what to say. The words she spoke were strange, almost mystical, but there was a truth to them that he couldn't deny. He could feel it too. There was something about this ship, something that went beyond just wires and engines. It was more than a machine. It was a presence, something alive. He turned back to the wreckage, his fingers grazing over the surface of the ship once more. This time, it felt different. The ship seemed to pulse beneath his touch, a warm energy flowing through his fingertips. Alec didn't know what was happening, but he didn't want to stop. "Can you help?" Alec asked, his voice unsure. "I don't know what I'm doing." Etrana stood silent for a moment, studying him. Her face was serious, but there was something else there, something vulnerable. "I can help you," she said quietly, "but I will need you to trust me, as I trust you." Alec nodded slowly. He didn't know what this strange connection meant, but he had already committed himself to helping her. Whatever this was, whatever this ship was, Alec couldn't walk away now. Together, they would have to repair the irreplaceable. Days passed since Alec had found Etrana, and the strange bond between them had only deepened. Her ship, his ship now, he thought, was slowly coming back to life. They worked together, each learning from the other. Alec's skill with machines, Etrana's knowledge of her people's technology, and their shared understanding of isolation and pain made them an unlikely but effective team. Despite the challenges, they found themselves making progress. Yet there was an unspoken tension in the air. Etrana had not shared much about her past, and Alec hadn't pressed her to. But as the ship's systems began to hum with life once more, Alec couldn't ignore the growing curiosity inside him. She had been through so much. He could see it in her eyes, hear it in her voice whenever she spoke about her people, her mission, her flight from something terrifying. It was clear she was hiding something, something more than just the wreckage of her ship. Alec didn't want to force her to open up, but he couldn't help wondering what lay behind her silence. One evening, while they were sitting in the dim light of the workshop, Etrana finally broke the silence. "Alec," she began, her voice soft but steady, "you asked me before about my people. I've not told you the whole truth." Alec looked up from the tools in his hands, surprised by the sudden shift in her tone. "You don't have to share anything you're not ready to," he said quietly, not wanting to push her. But she shook her head, her violet eyes gleaming with a mixture of pain and resolve. "No, I think it's time you know," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I can't carry this burden alone any longer." Alec set down his wrench and turned to face her, his heart beating faster. "You're not alone. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Etrana hesitated for a moment, her gaze distant, as though she was reliving something painful. Finally, she spoke. "My people, my species, are called the Erythians. We come from a planet far from here, beyond the stars you can see with your eyes. We were once a thriving civilization, advanced in ways you could not imagine. But we were too proud, too focused on our technology, on our pursuit of knowledge, that we forgot what made us truly alive. Alec listened carefully, his instincts telling him that this wasn't just a tale of loss. There was something deeper, something darker behind her words. We believed ourselves invincible, Etrana continued. We did not understand the cost of our pride until it was too late. There are forces in the universe, ancient and dangerous, that we cannot control. One such force is the null void. Alec frowned. The null void. What is it? Etrana's eyes darkened, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. The null void is a presence, a being, or perhaps something beyond being, that consumes everything in its path. Entire civilizations, entire planets, reduced to nothing. It doesn't care who or what you are. It does not spare anyone. It is relentless. Alec felt a cold chill run down his spine as the weight of her words settled on him. But your people. Etrana's expression hardened, her eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. We thought we could stop it. We thought we could build something powerful enough to defend ourselves. But we were wrong. When the null void came for us, we were already too late. It tore through our planet, destroyed everything. My people, my family. Her voice broke slightly, but she quickly steadied herself. I was one of the few to escape. The ship you're fixing was meant to carry me to safety. But not just me. There were others too. We were fleeing, trying to outrun the darkness that was consuming our world. Alec felt his heart ache for her, for the weight of her loss. He could see the pain in her eyes, the way her body tensed whenever she spoke of her past. It wasn't just the destruction of her people that hurt her. It was the memory of failing to save them, of not being able to protect those she loved. What happened to the others? Alec asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Etrana's face twisted with grief. They're gone. The null void caught up with us. I was the only one who made it out. I left everything behind. My planet, my family, my home. She paused, her eyes distant once more. The worst part is that I can't go back. I can't save them. They're gone, and I am the last of my kind. The silence between them was heavy. Alec wanted to say something, anything to ease her pain, but words felt meaningless in the face of such loss. Instead, he stood up and walked over to her, offering his presence. He didn't have any grand words to comfort her, but he knew that sometimes just being there was enough. Etrana looked at him, her violet eyes filled with gratitude. I should have told you earlier, she said quietly, but I didn't want to burden you with my past. Alec shook his head. You're not a burden. I'm just glad you trusted me enough to share it. She gave a small, rueful smile, but the sadness in her eyes didn't go away. I don't know what to do anymore. The null void is still out there, still hunting me. And I don't know if I can keep running. Alec felt the weight of her words, and for the first time since meeting her, he realized that her pain mirrored his own. He had lost so much, his wife, his child, his sense of purpose. But Etrana had lost even more. She had lost an entire world. I won't let you face this alone, Alec said firmly, his voice steady. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. I've got your back. Etrana met his gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, a spark of hope flickered in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry this burden alone after all. The days following Etrana's revelation were filled with a quiet intensity. Alec worked on her ship, which was slowly taking shape again, while Etrana kept to herself, spending hours scanning the horizon, her mind clearly somewhere far away. The bond between them had only grown stronger, though the weight of her past still hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Alec could sense it, but neither of them was ready to talk more about the null void or what lay ahead. They simply focused on the present, on what they could do together now. One evening, as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Alec stood outside the workshop, taking in the quiet. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying with it a dusting of sand from the barren landscape. It was a stark contrast to the life he had once known. Chaos, noise, endless movement. But here, in this desolate place, there was peace, and for the first time in a long while, Alec found himself appreciating it. He heard a soft sound behind him and turned to see Etrana standing in the doorway, her violet skin glowing faintly in the dusk. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes seemed to hold a depth of thought. She stepped outside and walked toward him, the soft crunch of her boots on the dirt, the only sound between them. "You're quiet tonight," Alec said, breaking the silence. "Anything on your mind?" Etrana didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood beside him, gazing out across the wasteland. For a moment, she seemed lost in her thoughts, the distant stars above reflecting in her eyes. "I've been thinking about the null void," she said finally, her voice calm. But Alec could hear the undercurrent of tension in her words, about how it's always there, always waiting. "It's not something I can outrun forever. Sooner or later, it will find me again." Alec didn't know how to respond. The thought of an unstoppable force like the null void was something he couldn't even begin to wrap his head around. He'd been dealing with his own personal losses for so long, but Etrana's battle was on a different level entirely. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting against the very nature of the universe itself. "I don't think you're running anymore," Alec said after a pause, his voice steady but full of conviction. "You're facing it, and whatever comes next, you won't face it alone. I promised." Etrana turned to him, a faint smile playing at the corner of her lips. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but to Alec, it felt like a victory. For the first time since they had met, he saw a glimmer of hope in her expression, something that wasn't just the weight of her burden. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she said quietly, almost to herself. Then, as if realizing what she had said, she cleared her throat and looked away. "But we can't waste time. The null void is still out there, and I can't hide forever." Alec nodded. "We'll finish the ship, and then we'll figure out what to do next. Together." Etrana seemed to think for a moment before speaking again, her voice firm. "There's something I haven't told you yet, something important." Alec raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" She glanced at him, her gaze intense. "The null void isn't just after me. It's after anyone who's connected to my people. If it finds me, it will destroy everything in its path to get to me. And that includes you, Alec." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. Alec swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had known there was danger, but he hadn't fully understood just how far that danger stretched. The null void wasn't just a threat to Etrana. It was a threat to anyone close to her. "I'm not scared of it," Alec said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've fought through my own battles before, and I'm not backing down now. But we need to be ready. We can't let it catch us off guard." Etrana looked at him with something akin to admiration in her eyes, but there was still a shadow of worry in her expression. "You're brave, Alec, but bravery won't be enough against the null void. It's not something you can fight with a weapon or a plan. It's a force that consumes everything it touches." Alec clenched his fists, frustration building inside him. He didn't like the idea of being powerless, of having no control over what was coming. But he knew that Etrana was right. There were things in this universe that no one could defeat with strength alone. This null void was one of those things. "So what do we do?" Alec asked, his voice rough. "If we can't fight it, what's the plan?" Etrana hesitated, her eyes scanning the stars above. "We don't fight it. We outrun it. We get far enough away that it can't find us. We go to the last place where the null void has never been. There are places in the galaxy where its reach doesn't extend." Alec didn't know if he believed her, but he could see the resolve in her eyes. It was the same kind of determination he had seen in himself when he fought to survive after losing everything. There was no turning back now. Whatever this null void was, they would have to face it head on. "Where do we go?" Alec asked. Etrana's lips curled into a faint, almost sad smile. "I know a planet no one has heard of, a place hidden from the stars. It's our best chance." Alec nodded. "Then that's where we go. But we're not running. We're surviving. And we're doing it together." As they stood there, side by side, watching the stars above, Alec felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was uncertain, and the threat of the null void loomed large, but for the first time since he had met Etrana, Alec felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone, and neither was she. Together, they would face whatever came next. The ship was ready. After countless hours of hard work and collaboration, Alec and Etrana had managed to repair the once shattered vessel. The humming of its engines filled the air as the ship stood at the edge of the wasteland, waiting. The ship was no longer just a machine. It had become a symbol of hope, a fragile lifeline that carried them both into the unknown. Alec stood at the controls of the ship, his fingers lightly tracing the holographic interface. The technology was unfamiliar to him, but with Etrana's guidance, he had learned how to navigate through the complex systems. The ship was unlike anything he had ever seen, its design sleek and organic, almost as if it had grown from the very ground it rested on. It was alive in a way that human technology could never be. Beside him, Etrana was silent, her gaze fixed on the starry sky outside the viewports. The weight of their journey hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. She had been through so much already, and yet she was still here, still fighting, still hoping. Alec admired her strength, but he knew she carried the burden of her past with her. The null void was still out there, waiting, and every day that passed brought them one step closer to the storm. "Alec," Etrana's voice broke the silence, soft but clear. "Are you ready?" Alec glanced over at her, taking in the quiet resolve on her face. She had been through more than anyone should have to endure, but now she was focused on the future, on survival. "Ready as I'll ever be," he replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. He activated the ship's engines, feeling a slight vibration beneath his feet as the vessel lifted off the ground. The view through the cockpit windows shifted as they slowly ascended, the wasteland below shrinking away. Alec couldn't help but feel a sense of finality as the planet below them faded from view. There was no going back now. They were on their way to a new life, or at least a new chance. As the ship ascended into the darkness of space, Alec felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The vastness of the universe stretched out before them, endless and full of possibilities. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The null void was out there, lurking in the shadows of the stars, waiting to find them. Etrana seemed to sense his unease. She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "We don't have much time. The null void doesn't wait for anyone." Alec nodded grimly. "I know, but we've got a head start. If we can stay ahead of it, we might have a chance." She met his gaze, her eyes dark with the weight of what they were running from. "There's no guarantee, Alec. The null void has found civilizations before, and it never misses. It's a predator, and we're its prey." The words sent a chill down Alec's spine, but he didn't let it show. He had faced death before, in ways both big and small, and he wasn't about to back down now. Not when there was still a chance to fight. "We'll make it," Alec said, more to reassure himself than anything else. "We'll find a place where it can't reach us." Etrana's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you're right. But you must understand, Alec, no place is truly safe. Not from the null void." Alec was quiet for a moment, contemplating her words. He had been hoping that there was a way to outrun their pursuer, but the more Etrana spoke about it, the clearer it became that the null void was not something that could simply be escaped. It was a force, not a creature. A force that would stop at nothing to consume everything in its path. They flew through space in silence, the stars streaking past them as the ship's engines hummed steadily. Alec kept his eyes on the controls, guiding the ship further into the vast emptiness. But his mind kept returning to Etrana's words. No place was safe. Not from the null void. As the hours passed, Alec noticed something strange on the ship's scanners, an anomaly, a distortion in the fabric of space itself. It wasn't much, just a slight flicker, but it was enough to make Alec's heart race. "Etrana," Alec said, his voice tense. "Look at the scanners. Do you see that?" Etrana moved quickly to the control panel, her eyes narrowing as she studied the readings. "That's not a natural phenomenon. It's too concentrated. Something's out there." Alec felt his stomach drop. He knew what it meant, even before Etrana confirmed it. "It's the null void," Etrana said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alec's hand hovered over the ship's controls, his mind racing. "How far are we from it?" Etrana glanced at the readouts, her expression grim. "Too close. It's moving faster than we anticipated. We need to change course. Now." Alec's heart pounded as he adjusted the ship's trajectory, hoping they could outrun the encroaching force. He could feel the tension building in the air, both of them knowing the risks, knowing the odds were stacked against them. But they had no choice but to keep moving forward. The ship began to shake slightly, the tension of their flight matching the rising fear in Alec's chest. The null void was real, and it was closer than they had imagined. The journey that had once seemed like a path to freedom was now a race for survival. "We won't make it at this speed," Alec said, his voice strained. "We need to push the ship harder." Etrana nodded, her face set in determination. "Do it. We can't let it catch us." Alec gritted his teeth as he pushed the ship's engines to their limits. The stars outside seemed to blur as they hurtled through space, faster than before. Alec could feel the strain on the ship, could hear the engines groaning under the pressure, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not now. They were in a race against time, against the unstoppable force of the null void, and Alec was determined to win. The stars outside the ship's viewports had begun to blur into streaks of light as Alec pushed the ship's engines beyond their limits. The hum of the ship grew louder, vibrating through the metal frame like the growl of an animal, urging them forward. Alec's hands were steady on the controls, but inside, his heart raced. The null void was out there, somewhere, and they were running straight toward it. Etrana was silent beside him, her eyes focused on the scanners. Her face was calm, but Alec could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the edge of her seat. She was thinking the same thing he was. No one outruns the null void. It was only a matter of time before it caught up with them. "We're not going to make it," Alec muttered, more to himself than to Etrana. The ship was pushing at its limits, but the null void was still too close. They needed more time, more distance, but the vacuum of space offered no refuge. Etrana glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "We don't need to outrun it. We need to survive it." Alec's eyes flickered to the monitor as he tried to keep the ship steady. "How?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the controls beside her and began inputting data into the ship's system. "There is a place," she said finally. "A hidden station, built by my people before the null void arrived. It's been abandoned for centuries, but it's still functional. It's the only place I know where we might be able to hide long enough to plan our next move." Alec's fingers tightened on the controls. A hidden station. How far? Etrana's eyes flickered to the map on the screen. "We're close. But it's not enough to just get there. The null void has a way of finding things, even hiding places." Alec's mind raced. If there was any chance of surviving, they had to take it. He had promised her they would make it. He had promised himself. They couldn't afford to fail now. "Tell me what to do," Alec said, his voice steady. Etrana's fingers flew across the console, her movements quick and precise. "A station is equipped with a cloaking device, but it's not foolproof. We'll need to activate it once we're within range. But the null void is no ordinary enemy. It can sense changes in energy, even the smallest disturbance. We'll have to remain absolutely still once we arrive. No sudden movements. No signals. Nothing. Alec nodded. He had faced danger before, but this was different. The null void wasn't just an enemy. It was a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. But the station might be their only chance. Let's make it there, Alec said, determination hardening his voice. They flew in silence for what seemed like hours, the tension between them growing heavier with each passing minute. Alec kept his focus on the ship's controls, his mind on their mission. Etrana was a constant presence at his side, guiding him with her calm, steady voice, but he could tell she was preparing herself for what was to come. This station, this last hope, was a gamble. It might work, or it might be a trap. We're almost there, Etrana said quietly, her voice steady despite the rising danger. Prepare for a quick approach. Alec adjusted the ship's trajectory, his eyes scanning the scanners for any signs of movement. The null void could appear at any moment, and once it did, there would be no escaping it. The ship trembled under the strain, but Alec pushed it harder, trying to squeeze every last bit of speed from the engines. Suddenly, the ship's sensors lit up, a burst of red flashing across the screen. Null void, Alec muttered under his breath, his heart sinking. They had reached the station, but the force was already here, closing in on them with terrifying speed. Etrana acted quickly, her fingers flying across the control panel. Activating cloaking device now. The ship's hum shifted, growing softer, as the cloaking field began to envelop the vessel. The stars outside seemed to fade, blurring together until there was only darkness. Alec held his breath, his hands tight on the controls, as the null void seemed to pass right by them. The sensors were barely picking up anything, as if they were invisible to the very force that had consumed entire planets. The ship's shaking slowed, and Alec finally exhaled, his body tense with the effort of staying still. He couldn't risk making a mistake now. Etrana didn't speak for a long while, her eyes focused on the scanners. Alec knew she was just as on edge as he was. They had done everything they could to hide, but the null void was still out there, still searching. After what felt like an eternity, Etrana finally spoke. It's gone. For now. Alec's shoulders sagged with relief, but the weight of their situation remained. They had survived for the moment, but the null void wasn't going to stop. Not until it found them. And once it did, there would be no hiding. We need to make a plan, Etrana said, her voice low. This isn't over. Alec nodded, his mind already racing. They had made it to the station, but the null void was still out there, waiting. They had one chance, one opportunity to survive, and Alec knew they couldn't afford to waste it. Let's get inside, Alec said, his voice grim. We'll figure it out from there. Together, they moved toward the hidden station, knowing that even though they had won this battle, the war was far from over. The hidden station stood before them like a shadow in the void. It was a vast, silent structure, its edges blending with the darkness of space. Alec and Etrana had approached cautiously, knowing they had little time before the null void would return. The cloaking device had bought them a few precious moments, but it was clear that the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The ship touched down gently on the station's landing pad, the hum of the engines slowly dying down. Alec quickly shut off the power, his eyes scanning the outside through the cockpit's viewport. The stars above them seemed impossibly distant now, as if they had slipped into a different world entirely. A part of him almost wished they had never found this place, that they could have kept flying forever, out of reach of the null void. But they had no such luck. The truth was, there was no escaping what was coming. They would have to face it, no matter what. Etrana stood up first, moving toward the airlock. We need to be careful, she said, her voice steady, though there was a sharpness to it. This station hasn't been used in centuries. It may be empty, but we can't assume it's safe. Alec nodded, following her as she led the way. They moved quickly through the narrow corridors of the station, the walls dimly lit by faded lights that flickered occasionally. The station felt cold and abandoned, but there was an undeniable sense of history in the air. This place had once been a sanctuary, a refuge for Etrana's people, before the null void had destroyed everything they had built. They reached the central control room, where Etrana immediately began accessing the old systems. Alex stood by, watching her work. He could see the familiar look of concentration on her face, the way her eyes darted across the screens as she tried to bring the ancient systems back online. "We need to activate the station's defenses," Etrana said after a moment, her voice urgent. "The null void will be able to find us eventually, and we don't have the time to wait for it to come to us. We need to take the fight to it." Alec glanced at her, his expression serious. "What kind of defenses are we talking about?" Etrana paused, then looked at him, her expression hard. The station was built to withstand attacks from outside forces, but it was never meant to fight something like the null void. Still, there may be some systems we can use to protect ourselves, at least for a while. She activated a series of controls, and the walls of the room shifted, revealing hidden compartments and weapons that had been stored away for ages. Alec's eyes widened as he saw the advanced technology, energy weapons, shields, and other equipment that seemed far more advanced than anything he had ever seen. Etrana had been right. This station was a treasure trove of forgotten technology. "We won't be able to fight it directly," Etrana said, her voice firm. "But we can use these weapons to slow it down. If we can disrupt its energy, if we can create enough of a disturbance, maybe we can give ourselves enough time to plan our next move." Alec didn't hesitate. "Let's do it." Together, they began activating the weapons systems, setting up energy shields around the station's core, and aligning the energy beams to strike the null void if it came too close. They worked quickly, the pressure of time pressing on them with every passing second. Alec could feel the sweat on his brow as he set up the final defense. They had done all they could to prepare, but there was no guarantee it would be enough. Etrana looked at him one last time, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "We fight together, Alec, no matter what happens." Alec nodded, his heart steady. He had made it this far because of his determination, because of the promise he had made to her, and he wasn't about to break that promise now. The null void came for them, faster than they had expected. It was a storm of energy, a wave of nothingness that tore through the fabric of space itself. Alec felt it before he saw it, the sudden pressure in the air, the strange stillness that preceded the storm. Etrana quickly activated the station's defenses, sending a burst of energy into the path of the oncoming force. The beams of energy crackled through the space, but the null void was relentless. It pushed forward, slowly absorbing the energy, undeterred by the station's feeble defenses. "We need to buy more time," Etrana said, her voice tight with strain. "Activate the emergency cloaking. We have to move before it consumes everything." Alex scrambled to the controls, his mind racing. The emergency cloaking device was their last hope, a way to hide from the null void long enough to escape. He pushed the button, and the station shimmered for a moment before fading from view. They were invisible once again, but Alec knew it wouldn't last. The null void was close now, and it would never stop hunting them. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours, but finally, the storm passed. The force of the null void moved away, its presence fading, though Alec could feel the lingering tension in the air. "We did it," Alec said, his voice quiet but filled with relief. Etrana exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging as she turned to him. "For now. But it's not over. The null void will return, and when it does, we'll have to be ready." Alec took a step closer to her, the weight of their situation settling in. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the strength of their bond, the knowledge that they were in this together. "We will be," Alec said, his voice steady. "We've survived this far. We can make it through the next part too. Etrana looked at him, a small, almost imperceptible smile crossing her face. Together. And as the station remained hidden in the vastness of space, Alec and Etrana knew that the fight for survival was not over. But as long as they had each other, they would continue to face the null void head-on, no matter what the universe threw their way.